All right. Has anyone here seen the movie Up before? You see? Have we all? Most of us seen it. It's a really good flick. It's a really good movie. Up. It's easily I think one of the most touching, kind of thoughtful, creative movies that I have ever seen. I think. Now, if you have seen Up, you know that Up follows the story of Carl Fredricksen. He looks like this. He looks like a grumpy fellow. I'm not saying he resembles anyone here, okay? He doesn't. I'm not saying that. But he is kind of what he looks like, which is this curmudgeonly older fellow who is a widower, who then goes on, I'm just giving you a little bit of the plot. He goes on, he wants to fulfill his lifelong dream of he and his wife of flying to South Africa by tying balloons to his house and floating all the way there. This is all in honor of his late wife, Ellie, which is this incredibly sweet and touching story. Now, what makes this movie great is the relationship that Carl has with a young boy named Russell. Russell is the perfect counterpart to Carl in this story. Russell is earnest and kind and enthusiastic. And all Russell wants to do is he wants to help Carl cross the street so that he can earn his final merit badge and become a senior wilderness explorer. Senior wilderness explorer. And I think one of my favorite scenes from the movie is this portion where Carl is just taking flight. He's flown over the city that surrounds him, and now he is peacefully drifting over the countryside, and he sits down quietly in his chair to rest when he hears a knock at the door. Confused, he gets up, he opens the door and looks around, and at first he doesn't see anyone, but then he looks to his right and he discovers Russell stuck on the porch, fearfully backed up against the wall, like this. Carl is shocked. He says, "What are you doing here?" And Russell explains how he got there. He was looking for snipes, which of course he did on the behest of Carl, which Carl was just trying to get rid of him. And then Russell asks, this is this moment that I love. Russell asks Carl to come into the house, and Carl, true to form, shouts, "No," and he slams the door right in his face. Only a few moments later, to open the door and say, "Oh, all right, you can come in." He kind of begrudgingly lets Russell into the house. Now, for my money, this is like a perfect scene. Carl is such a curmudgeon. He's so set in his ways that he can barely bring himself to let poor Russell into his house. Carl is a good example of what happens to us when we become so set in our ways. Right? I bet we all know someone who has become maybe too set in their ways. And I bet that each of us in our own lives have at various times become too set in our ways of something. Right? For example, does anyone here have a very, very particular way of how they fill the dishwasher? Right? Okay, I see some hands. I see a few hands, right? Or has ordered the same thing at the same restaurant for the 1,000th time, right? We've all probably done a little bit of that, right? Or even just an opinion that we're inflexible on, right? As people, we're all, at least all of us are a little bit like this. We're all at times a little rigid and a little set in our own ways, right? And our gospel stories, there's really two separate stories in our gospel lesson today. They both have something to tell us about what God has to say about that sort of rigidity. So a little background here. We've shared information like this in the past, but we'll kind of reshare. It's always good to resurface this. In the Old Testament, there are about 613 laws that the Israelite people follow. And one's holiness broadly speaking, was measured by how well you're able to follow those rules. And part of the rule set includes, of course, a list of all sorts of foods. It's called kosher, that you were supposed to eat or not supposed to eat. And if you came and you ate something that was unclean, you would be considered unclean because you ate this sort of impure food. So as you might expect, the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders at the time were quite rigid about following some of these dietary expectations. And in our gospel lesson today, Jesus shares this teaching with us, which sort of upends this very kind of like spiritual rigidity, right? He says this, he says, listen and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles. What he's saying is it's actually what comes from our heart, right, that defies a person spiritually. Not so much what you put into your body, but what comes out of your heart or your mind, we might say. All right, and this is can be looked at as both very good or very bad news. If you like bacon, it's very good news for you, right? If you're a bacon lover, it's very good news for you. But generally for all of us, this is a reminder that we all have things in our heart that are not the best. But after Jesus teaches this to the disciples and the Pharisees and the crowd gathered, the disciples come over to him and they say, I don't know if you know this, Jesus, but you kind of riled the feathers of those Pharisees. He says they're like the blind leading the blind. He has some harsh words for them. And why the harsh words for the Pharisees? Why the harsh words over this? I read this and I think that Jesus says this because they are so sort of rigid and inflexible that they're unable to listen and to understand, that they're unable to hear God's voice or feel, that little feeling of a nudge from the Holy Spirit. They're unable to feel that or to experience that or to hear the truth of what Jesus is saying in the midst of their just kind of stiffness. And then we come to this next story, which is kind of seems very unrelated at first. Right? They don't seem connected, but I think there's a reason Matthew puts these two stories together. In it, Jesus is approached by a Canaanite woman, in other words, a pagan woman who does not share Jesus' Jewish heritage. This woman asks Jesus to heal her daughter. And Jesus first ignores her, doesn't even listen. She persists. And then he has a harsh words for her. He says, it's not fair to take the children's food and give it to the dogs. Ouch. It's rough language. But Jesus here, I think as a way to help us understand, is really living into these laws and customs that he was raised in, right? This is how a Jewish person is supposed to respond to a Canaanite. That's the system that he grew up in. Israelites do not mix with pagans. It's one of those 613 laws we referenced earlier, right? But the woman responds and says this, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed from that moment. Now, I guess my question for us today is, what's the difference between the first story that we heard and this story? In the first story, the religious leaders were so rigid, they were unable to be changed by their encounter with God. They stayed the same. They stuck with what they knew. But in the second story, Jesus actually defies this sort of rigid cultural narrative that Jews can't interact with pagans. He's had an experience of someone else. He's had an encounter with someone else, and he allows that to change his heart. Jesus then heals this woman. And I wonder if the lesson to be learned from this story is that it can be holy to change one's mind in light of new evidence or better ideas, or just the nudge of the Holy Spirit. And that our call as Christians sometimes is to open the door when the Holy Spirit comes knocking. Because I think the Holy Spirit is very much like Russell. Right? I think the Holy Spirit is knocking on the door and asking us, can I come in? And we are often very much like Carl, stuck in our ways saying, no. But here's the thing. Even this sort of eventual reluctant acquiescence of Carl to let Russell into his house changes Carl's life. Right? Russell's presence, just letting Russell in allows in new love and new hope and new life, where previously there had been only grief and sadness and loneliness. That's what makes this such a beautiful story, is letting something new in really transforms Carl. Is there anything in your life that you hold on to a little too tightly? Are you able to welcome someone new into your circle? Are you willing to sort of change your mind in light of new evidence? Are you willing to have your heart opened up and to be moved by the nudge of the Holy Spirit? Or maybe it's a political opinion or a scientific one. Maybe you're more interested in winning an argument than hearing the truth. I think we're all there sometimes. Or maybe at work it's just shutting down new ideas without actually thinking about them. Or whatever it is, for all of us, there will be times when the Holy Spirit comes knocking, and you should answer the door and let her in. It will change your life. Thanks be to God.